Which bone forms the side and roof of the cranial cavity? Parietal bone. Which bone contains the sella turcica? Sphenoid bone. Which bone houses the mastoid process? Temporal bone. Which bone contains the cribriform plate? Ethmoid bone. Which is the only movable bone of the skull? Mandible. Which bone forms the upper jaw? Maxilla. Which bone forms the prominence of the cheek? Zygomatic bone. Which is the smallest facial bone? Lacrimal. Which bone forms the forehead? Frontal. Which bone forms the lower back portion of the skull and articulates with the atlas? Occipital. Which paired bones form the bridge of the nose? Nasal. Which paired, curved bones, project inward from the sides of the nasal cavity, below the other turbinates? Inferior nasal conchae. Did you master the bones? Then let's level up to processes. Which process forms the posterior half of the bony side arch of the skull, just in front of the ear? Zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Which process forms the lower outer rim of the eye socket, projecting upward from the bone that holds the upper teeth? Zygomatic process of the maxilla. Which process forms the lateral corner of the upper eye socket rim, where it meets the facial bone at the outer orbit? Zygomatic process of the frontal bone. Which pointed bony projection from the base of the skull anchors the stylohyoid and styloglossus muscles? Styloid process. Which rounded bony prominence behind the ear serves as an attachment site for the sternocleidomastoid muscle? Mastoid process. Which bony projection of the maxilla and mandible forms the tooth-bearing ridge? Alveolar process. Which bony projection, on the anterior superior ramus of the mandible, anchors the temporalis muscle? Coronoid process. Which rounded projection on the posterior superior ramus of the mandible, articulates with the temporal bone to form the jaw joint? Condyloid process. Which projection of the maxilla forms the anterior three-quarters of the hard palate? Palatine process of maxilla.